Good afternoon. I'm Tom Carroll. Today is January 20th, 2014, and we're at the Sierra Two Center in Curtis Park in Sacramento, California, as part of the My Story Project. Today we're going to talk to Ken Bryne about his life and the background of Native Americans in Northern California. Good afternoon, Ken.
Hi, Tom. Good to see you.
Good to see you. Ken and I have been friends for, about 15 years, I guess, and we met through mutual friends. Ken plays music and he does arts, and we met through friends that do both those things. And Ken, I think I'd like you to start about just talking about, 1,000, 2,000 years ago. What was it like in Northern California?
Well, obviously I wasn't there, but an article came out in the paper in the 70s when I was a teenager about some carvings that were recently discovered. They say had been lost for 80 years. And when I showed the article to my mother, she said, well, they haven't been lost at all. We knew where they were, and nobody ever asked to see them. So some of the carvings date back about 2,000 years, and some of them even go back as far as 4,000 years. They're somewhere along the upper North Fork of the Eel River, and I'm not exactly sure where on the Eel River they are.
And they said there were like 95 different tribes or something.
Yes, along the Eel River there at one time there was about 95 tribes until about 1861 and 62, when I'm not sure what brought on the massacres, but they systematically eliminated each one of the villages as completely as they could.
Well, I remember I always thought, having been raised back east, I assumed the gold rush had a lot to do with the problem. No, it wasn't the gold rush, it was the railroad, of course.
Seems to me more the railroad, especially where we were right in the redwoods, and we were right along the river, and both things were exactly what the railroad wanted. And so most of that land did eventually end up owning to the railroad.
And we also want to show Ken's tribal identification card. We all have driver's license. This, and again, you'll see a picture of this big form, but it says Round Valley Indian Tribes, official tribal identification, Kenneth Dale Byrne. Now, tell me about the tribes. You can belong to a couple of tribes.
There's actually 9 tribes on the reservation, and without looking closely, I couldn't name them all. But Concow, Nomlaki, Wailaki, Pomo are a few of them.
And you were Wailaki, I guess.
I'm Wailaki, Little Lake, and apparently I'm a little bit of Bodega Bay. My great-grandfather.
And you told me that might be a good thing because they have a casino down there.
Hopefully. But as far as I know, this card entitles me to exactly nothing. No casino money, no dental work. No. It just identifies me as being a tribal member.
One of the things that, again, having moved to California, I understood that the gaming law meant that the larger tribes could form casinos, and all of the tribes were supposed to benefit. That's what we voted into law. Ken's a member of a much smaller tribe. You got one check once, right?
I did. I got a check for $61. Me and my 2 brothers and my 3 nephews. My sister had already passed, so my sister's 3 boys split that $61. They each got 20 apiece. And the only reason we got anything at all is because my mother had already passed, or my mother would have got the $240 check and we would have got nothing.
Right. But it just seems peculiar to me that he never got another check again. And of course, I keep encouraging him to go talk to a tribal attorney about this. But I think we should all be concerned that in fact benefits that are out of these casinos aren't apparently going to a lot of Native Americans.
Yes.
Ken, I think one of the most important things you and I wanted to accomplish today was talk about your great-grandmother and her story. Why don't you tell us about that?
Well, my mother started training me to remember this story when I was just a little child. And I heard it over and over again as long as she was alive. And so the story goes, great-grandmother was a survivor of one of the massacres on the Eel River. Unfortunately, her mother, father, brothers, sisters, uncles, aunts, and every one of her cousins were all killed. She was the only surviving member of our clan, our family, or whatever you would like to call it. She actually wasn't taken immediately to the reservation. She got away somehow, and we're not really sure how she managed to escape the carnage. But she was later on, about a year later, rounded up with some other people who had escaped their village massacres as well by the army. And the army marched them from Willits, someplace in that area, out to the reservation in Round Valley. So that begins her story of being on the reservation at that point. As just a young girl, she was, as far as I know, maybe 9 or 10. And so she was alone. A family called the Whipples basically adopted her, took her in, and helped her to survive.
Talk about the reservations. What they did was create these reservations and demanded that Native Americans go to the reservations, but then never supplied the reservations, I gather.
Well, they were supposed to go to the reservations for protection because they were apparently not really being killed by the army, but by white settlers. So it was supposed to be a place where they could be protected. And they did promise to bring them beef. And in fact, they did bring 30 head of beef every year to the reservation. But unfortunately, when the reservation was first started, 2 of the men who helped start the reservation went to Sacramento and got a grant to keep half of the valley for themselves, some 5,000 or 10,000 acres on the side of the valley that had all the water. And so these 2 ranchers basically commandeered the 30 head of steer for their ranch. And so that's how their ranch got started. They were the Asbills. And they still have one of the nicest ranches in the Round Valley.
And this evidently was real common. There was a lot of corruption among those that were supposed to be providing services for the reservation. And I know you and I have had discussions about Abraham Lincoln. I think a lot of people look upon Lincoln so high in terms of him ending the Civil War. Ken looks upon Lincoln as the guy that helped create the reservations and then didn't supply food for them, right?
Yeah. I don't know if we can blame the food supply on Lincoln, but he certainly had his part in
the overseer guy, whatever the head of
Yeah.
Indian Affairs, was a Lincoln appointee.
Right.
But what I read, he quit after a few years, frustrated that he couldn't get supplies to provide. Because, you know, I think that maybe the Civil War meant that they were not able to supply a lot to Native Americans in reservations in California and everything was going to fight the Civil War. So, but the point was there was a lot of suffering because there was. And what would happen? People would starve and then go kill a horse or a cattle.
Well, that was before the reservation when the settlers were first moving in. Some of them settled in areas where the Native American people weren't there during the summer or they weren't there during the winter, depending on the food source. You know, if it was salmon, they would migrate up there during the winter for the salmon run. If it was blackberries, they would migrate to a place for the blackberries to be picked. And so there would be a white family living in this area and claiming the land and then not wanting the Native Americans even around because they were just scared of them. And then a couple of Indians might kill a horse or something for food, and that would set the entire population of white people down on whatever local tribe was there. And in one case, in the story of the Natural Bridge massacre, was exactly that. 2 Indians came by, killed a man's mule, and they were found eating the mule. Those 2 Indians were killed, and then they went and killed all of the other Indians in the village, all except one who lived to tell the story. But That's pretty much the way it went throughout the whole area of.
There were these massacres periodically over some small thing that happened, and people would get. And I understood that you'd get people that would come out of the Civil War, both in the North and the South side, and it would be renegades that would come out west, maybe criminals, and they would be the ones that could get liquored up, and they would be a part of a posse going in just clobbering to death women and children and everybody.
Black Bart was known to have stayed at the Round Valley Reservation.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the only one I really know that actually was there. They have it's.
Well, who is Black Bart?
He was a notorious stage robber.
Oh, okay.
I don't know.
Probably one of my relatives.
I don't know that he was a big Indian killer.
Right,
In
right.
fact, I don't think he really was. I think his offense was more towards the whites than the Native
Right.
Americans.
So your great-grandmother survived this massacre, and then she was put on the reservation. Now, and she was on the reservation from a very small age.
Yes.
Right? And you want to talk about her basket?
Yeah, my mother was 15 years old when my great-grandmother died, and she, great-grandmother, made this basket for her. She made one for each of the children. I think there was 10 of them. And my mom was actually there to help her. It's made out of redbud root, and she peeled the bark off to make the white, and she left the bark on for the dark areas. So it was quite a process, and the roots had to be kept wet at all times. So my mom, as a young girl, kept the bucket full of water, kept the roots soaking for her, and helped her to dig them. But unfortunately, my mother never learned to weave like that, and so I never either.
So Ken, when your great-grandmother was taken to the reservation, what did they do to, how did they enroll her in the reservation?
Well, they all had forms to fill out, but one of the things they told them is that they couldn't use their own Native American names. They had to pick a name, or a name was assigned them, and I'm not sure how that exactly worked, if their names were assigned to them or they got a choice. But this is her thumbprint, and I don't believe that's her signature. I think it's the signature of the lady that was doing the paperwork.
And it also is interesting here, it says, has no Indian name. And what you're telling us, that's because they didn't allow her.
Yes, yeah. We're not supposed to practice the language, not supposed to practice the religion,
Talk about anything about your cultural past.
nothing. In fact, most of the story of her survival was suppressed because of that particular thing. They were not allowed to talk about the massacres that happened or how they survived. So I'm sure some of the people may have,
Right.
some other families may have better knowledge of that than I do.
Right.
But as far as our family goes, grandmother was pretty obliging and she didn't talk her language. She didn't
Right.
mention. My mother didn't even know her name was Sakura. I found that out when I was looking up documents on her to find out just what I could about her.
Right.
And so that's how I knew she actually had a Native American name.
I know when we talked about all this, you lent me this book, and to see a copy of the book. The name of it is Genocide and Vendetta, the Round Valley Wars of Northern California. And you can see this is a pretty beat up copy. This is Ken's family copy. And his comment to me was that this is in limited circulation because this has governors, members of counties, sheriffs, up in here about eradicating the pest of the natives. And when the book got published, it was grabbed up by people whose relatives are in the book. Now this is a story Ken told me. So I go to an international book site, find this book. You can buy it for $600 and up. And underneath one of the pictures on the book, it says, this is in limited circulation because it was bought up by people. The exact story that he told me is at the web page of this bookseller about what happened. So I found that really fascinating.
There are a lot of interesting stories in that book about the two guys, the Asbills, who helped with the reservation. In fact, that's where you can find the story about them claiming most of the reservation for themselves.
Right.
And at one point, in order to make their ranch better, they went off and killed 300 deer, left the carcasses, took the hides to Chico, and sold them for $1 a piece to buy things for their ranch that they needed. And you know, while the tribal people were starving, they were killing deer and just leaving them lay.
Just to get the dollar for the...
Just for the buckskins.
Right.
At one point, when my great-grandmother was first on the reservation, it was winter and there was no food source for a lot of the people who weren't from that area. They didn't know what they could eat and what they couldn't eat in that area, so a lot of them were starving. And they actually boiled their buckskins, the clothes they were wearing, for soup to get through the winter. A lot of them worked on the ranch too. They were, I don't know what they were paid to work on the ranch, or if they were paid anything, or just food, or whatever, but the Asbills employed a lot of the Native Americans from the reservation.
You know, we have here this treaty of 1851, and what the treaty did was designate where the boundary was for the reservation.
Yes.
And you're pointing out here, the signatures are on the treaty are all, these names are all set in as they might sound out. So it goes T, Nas, T, Ah, or John, whatever. And each one of these people put their marks, except one guy, I don't know if it's on this one or whatever, the guy that put his name.
Red Cap.
Red Cap.
Red Cap.
He was the only guy that signed his name, and Red Cap turned out got most of the land.
Yeah, in fact, a piece of this map here shows Red Cap's Creek.
Yeah, when we have a picture of this, you'll see of the territory, and one of it shows Red Cap's Creek. Yeah, right.
One of the most interesting things about this is the article, Article 6. It tells about all the things they were given. 500 pairs of strong cotton pantaloons, 500 cotton hickory shirts, 500 red flannel shirts, 500 strong cotton linsey gowns, needles, axes, pots, things like that. But then under Article 7, it is understood, however, that the agent shall use a sound discretion to the time and when the tribes or persons to whom the said goods shall be distributed, having reference to their peaceful disposition and good conduct. So basically, they outfitted an outpost store, and this guy could trade those goods for baskets, for labor, for wives, for anything that he wanted, because there was no oversight and no basically rules saying what he actually had to do with the stuff.
They had to be friendly to get the stuff, and he decided what friendly meant.
Yes, and who friendly was.
Right.
And oddly enough, the Indian agent's name is McKee, and I know the family well. I went to school with the daughter